Hello, this is Dr. Thiele, and this is our PF topic lecture for the April 2021 topic. And so the topic is the International Monetary Fund. So the benefits of the International Monetary Fund outweigh the harms. This is a pretty fun topic, I think. It's a pretty in-depth topic about a specific institution that a lot of people have some strong feelings of. Many people are very much against the IMF and blame it for a bunch of things, as our nice little cartoon likes to point out. And there's a lot of people that are in favor of the IMF and think it's better than the alternatives and it actually does good in the world. And so we're going to go through some of these and just talk more about what the IMF does. And so you have a good idea of what it does and what some of the popular arguments are on the topic. So the IMF, in a nutshell, does three basic things. It does economic surveillance, gives out money or loans, and then it gives out sort of technical assistance or what it calls capacity development. So to give you an example, economic surveillance is what you think. They study countries and publish little reports that give their risk assessment of each country, and that has an effect on that country's ability to get loans from other organizations or just the overall health of the economy itself. If the economy gets a very bad score, sometimes markets react by taking out money from the country, and which could further cripple the country further. And so that is why the IMF for surveillance is important to kind of countries look to it, and it does matter. Beyond that, the IMF also gives loans, and so they give a bunch of money to low-income countries and middle-income countries, and even a little bit of money through emergency lending to more higher-income countries that might particularly need it for a particular crisis. And so that is a second element they do. The third is capacity development, and they give money just to kind of train and promote better policies for governments to undertake upon their own. But it's just basically training and education. And so the one that most people are going to focus on this topic is number two, the lending and the loans. But it is important to know of some of the benefits and disadvantages of some of the other more fringe areas of the topic because they are part of the topic as well, and some teams will talk about it. Let's start out with lending, which is the most popular, important one. So IMF, some quick stats. They like to say they have about $1 trillion in lending power that they can give out to individual countries that are members. And so it is pretty much an international organization that started in 1944 that has about 190 different countries that are a member of and can draw access to funds when they need it. And so do they get money all the time through the IMF? No, it's more through when they need it. And so if there's a particular international crisis going on, and they're, example one, COVID, they might be more likely to reach into and ask for money to help overcome debts they're having in their country that they cannot pay because of they're not collecting enough taxes to pay those debts simply because they're not raising enough money and because the economy is not doing so well. Beyond that, note that when they give out the loans, so an advantage when you normally go to a bank and get a loan, there is an interest rate that's 10% per year or whatever high percent per year they want, and they quickly add up. The good thing about the IMF is the loans you can generally get do not have an interest rate attached to them. There are some that do, but the majority of the ones they give out, particularly the ones to low-income countries, don't have an interest rate on the loan, and so it's just whatever you collect, you pay back. And so it's a great way to not have to spend a bunch of money collecting interest rate payments that are just servicing the loan, not actually doing something for it. They also have basically three levels of lending. The first is the quota-based resource, which means no matter what, everyone can access a certain amount of funding as long as they meet the conditions up into the quota they're allowed to give. And so up to a certain percent of their quota, which is decided on their purchasing power or how much they've put into the organization, when troubles come, they can borrow up to a certain percentage, 150 or 50 or whatever the number is, over that quota number. Beyond that, if that is not meeting the arrangement, there's also multilateral borrowing arrangements that mean you can go beyond the quota and go through these other mechanisms within the IMF to get money. And if that doesn't matter, you can even do bilateral borrowing agreements within the IMF where you can't get the money from the IMF in whole, you can't get it through some of these secondary IMF tools, and so you have to individually negotiate and go through bilateral agreements with specific countries where they give you the loan for their own conditions they want to take on it. And so usually you start out with the quota because that'll have the easiest conditions and have the best terms. But if you can't get enough money from that, then you have to move on to the multilateral borrowing agreements. And if you can't get enough money from that because everyone's saying no or it's not covering your downfall, then you finally have to go into the bilateral world, which means individual one country negotiates with another country to get some money to cover that country's debt. What is this quota thing I talk about? Well, there are two basic, basically a quota is the amount of money they put in, the money you're giving into this organization that they can then lend out. Think of it, the money you're putting in the bank. You can only draw a certain amount of that money. And so it roughly parallels the amount you put in is the amount you can get back. It's not exact as you can look at the chart, but the United States is by far the largest, which means we put our quota shares over 17% of the overall available money. The U.S. is the one contributing. This matters because other countries are in the 6% range. China is only 6%, and if they have a crisis, they can draw up to that quota times a certain percentage. And so if you put in more money, you can get more money out. Beyond that, the quota rules are important for voting. And so if you want to change the overall rules of the structure, or if you want to change the particular quota allocation, you want to say give more votes to a specific country like Germany or Italy or India, it has to be a vote where 85% of everyone agrees to change it. The kicker of that is because the United States has over a 15% vote share, the United States basically has veto power. And so if they say no and don't want the change, it is not changing. And you have to convince them. At the very least, you must convince them plus a bunch of others. But if, for example, you convince everyone but China and China says no, they do not have that 15% power where they can veto the change. And so the moral of the story is the United States has sort of a strategic advantage where they can kind of control the overarching rules of the institution and the shares of voting for the institution purely because they have over 15% of a share of quota for voting. Where do they give money out right now? Is it only like one or two countries in one program? That is not true at all. So here is a very complicated chart that you can look into that show you all throughout the world. Here is the current lending and debt relief packages the IMF gives out and what type of program the money is going through. Is it a program that is going to be primarily going to be an unconditional loans or less conditions, or is it going to be a poverty program? Is it going to be a debt relief program? All are slightly different and have different terms and conditions than others. And so it's not true to say all IMF programs are the same. And it is also not true to say, there are whole countries that don't even take any money. Even, for example, East Asia, there are some countries in that Southeast Asia region and then that do take some money, even though after the Asian crisis, many people said these countries are never going to go back to the IMF. It's just kind of not true. A lot of poor countries do draw some money because it does offer loans that have a 0% interest rate, which they can't necessarily get from other institutions. Beyond this, there are a lot of differences between the loan programs. And so here are the example loan programs through normal IMF loans, which are, the standby arrangements, which is the most popular one. And there's a few others that kind of go down from there as well. The big thing to think about is, what are the conditions on the frameworks that are put on? Some have more conditions than less. When do you get the money? Do you get it immediately? Is it going to be phased in and you only get the money after you've met the conditions? How much money can you get? Can you get 100% of your quota, 200% of the quota, 145% of the quota, only 50% of the quota? That amount of money you put in somewhat conditions how much money you can take out in need. And so that quota affects the access limits of it. Whether there's a specific charge, are they charging any interest for a particular loan? Some of them do have interest, some of them don't have any interest. And so that's something to think about as well. And how long does it take to repay it? Are these going to be short-term loans that are less than about a year? Are these going to be long-term that can go all the way up to 10 years before you ultimately pay off the entirety of the loan? And so here are some things to think about when comparing. Beyond that, there's the second element of it, which is a more newer IMF program called the Poverty Reduction and Growth Facility Program. And this started in 1999, has really picked up steam in the 2010 plus. And so there are different type of loans throughout this program, But the important thing to think about is there are no conditions on these loans. I'm sorry, there are some conditions, but there is no interest on any of these loans. Beyond that, the conditions aren't usually as harsh as some of the conditions on the normal program. It's because this loan is meant to help the country reduce poverty, to fight poverty, not necessarily to help the country pay back loans to this rich nation, which is what the normal loans might be used for, to pay off their debts. This is purely meant to help countries that are suffering through poverty get some money they can use to help improve the poorest of their society to do better, which means some of the conditions are going to be more tailored to ensuring the money gets distributed from the rich country government in charge all the way to the poorest people actually get the money, and it doesn't just go to their friends. And so here's an example of some of the differences between their programs, the eligibility, what type of countries can get it, and some of the different length and things like that as well as what the quota limits are. And so again, much like the other normal types of loans, this is one that's also somewhat pegged to a quota, and you can only draw a certain percentage based upon what you've put in. Let's look at some quick charts to kind of explain the differences between these two programs. So the ones that focus on poverty, which is the PRGF, and I'm just going to call poverty, they generally have a result of actually not trading off. So the normal moral story before this was if a country has to pay back debts, they have to cut a bunch of budget deficits, which means a bunch of teachers and hospitals that would be getting money from the government. Those all get cut because they're the first to go, and who cares if we don't have teachers? Who cares if we don't have hospitals? As long as we can pay our debts back to the United States, we're good. That obviously didn't work as well because when the country, fired a bunch of teachers and fired a bunch of, stopped building a lot of hospitals, then the country suffered and got poor and they couldn't actually pay back their loans. And so it's changed as a result of this to actually not the result of these types of funds is the government doesn't cut away their health, education, poverty, and stuff like that, but rather the conditions are more tailored, less to, having to privatize, having to cut this type of taxes, having regressive taxes. Instead, the conditions are more based upon corruption and to minimize corruption, to have financial transparency, to ensure the money we actually give you to help on poverty goes all the way down the line and actually gets the very poor and puts food in their mouth. And so this shows you how this new program has a little bit different results, has a little bit different effects based upon traditional IMF lending programs, and that's shown on chart 2. Beyond that, the IMF also does some very easy things as well that it's hard to say. They give charitable contributions, which means a certain amount of money that the IMF has. They then give out to people, to charities worldwide, and it's very hard to say these charities are bad. And so there's millions of dollars given out by the IMF to charities who feed people, deal with COVID, all sorts of stuff. Now, can you say those are bad? Nope, can't really impact turn it, but you could say it's pretty tiny. Giving out a few million is nothing when the IMF has the capability to lend up to $1 trillion. It's pennies on the thousands of dollars at that point. And so it's really, really, really a tiny amount. And so while it isn't hard to say that, it's hard to say that these charitable contributions are bad, it's not hard to say they have very little effect. But it's something to be aware of, something the IMF does do that is innately good. Beyond that, they also do debt relief. And so there are countries that the IMF has given loans to before, and those countries, because of situations that happened with their economy, have no chance of ever paying it back. And so the IMF occasionally gives debt relief and says, fine, we're not going to, for the ones that might have a slight interest rate or slight conditions, they might say, fine, you're not going to be able to, pay me back, and so we'll forgive a certain amount of the money we've given you. Or in the example that has been touted is Haiti, they actually canceled the entire country's debt to the IMF, where they had hundreds of billions of dollars that they had given to the country that the country had to pay back. And they said, you know what, you've went through a bunch. There's a whole history of colonialism with your country, plus these recent events have caused crises. We think it's just better in the interest of everyone that we forgive the entire debt. And so that is something the IMF has done, debt relief, which is also very hard to say is bad in any way possible. It is something that the IMF had done that is innately good. And at best, the negative and con can say, well, giving debt relief on a debt you've already given, you got them in debt in the first place by giving them these conditional loans. Then saying we'll forgive some of the debt isn't not necessarily a net positive thing. It might just be, making it not as bad as it could be if we didn't forgive anything. And so while it's hard to say this is a bad thing, it is pretty easy to say it doesn't have as much of an effect as the pro might be trying to say it actually does. Surveillance. Let's talk more about a little bit about surveillance. And so with surveillance is another thing the IMF does. In fact, if you look at their overall budget, surveillance is almost 50% of their budget, which is a huge amount. Now, what are they doing? Are they showing up with like nuclear inspectors to kind of investigate each of the companies and to look at the pockets of each of the each of the leaders and to show up with armed troops to say, show me your castle. And if they say no, they shoot the people and come on in and inspect the documents? Not really. That's not how the IMF works. It's more making these reports from afar. So while they're in their offices throughout the world, they collect all this information from the governments. And then if the information is good, they adjust that information to make sure it's accurate, and then they publish their predictions based on that information. And so these assessments that they use are used both for bilateral, regional, and multilateral frameworks. And so other institutions, including even the IMF, use these assessments in reports that the IMF publishes to decide, are you a good country? Can we expect you pay back the loan? If so, because the IMF says you do pay back the loan, then here's some more money and we'll make it for easier conditions. If not, maybe we want to charge you a bunch more money, higher interest rate to get this loan. Or maybe we want to instead of charging you money, we want to have more conditions to ensure we actually get the money back. It also not only affects the government, if the surveillance reports affects individual companies that are just operating in the country. And so if you're a company, say, Amazon, and you have hired a factory to build some stuff for an Amazon product, and that factory is in a country that is having IMF reports, if the IMF is saying that country is about to go under and any money you put in, the government's going to be corrupt and seize, all of your factories and steal all of your money, then Amazon's going to be more likely to say, uh-oh, I can't trust this government. Maybe I need to move my factory or just not build it there in the first place. And so these reports not only affect the government's ability to get money from the IMF or other even governments, it affects just the company in general's ability, or the country in general's ability to collect FDI or money from just other corporations who want to invest in the country. Because if they don't think that country is reliable, then they're not going to invest. And the IMF reports help add to the reliability of the country. The downside of that, of course, I'll go back, I'm sorry, real quick, is it's hard to, quantify that exact effect. And so while it's hard to say the surveillance is bad, it's, also equally hard to say, here's the exact number of lives saved because of this report that got published. Specifically, since there are other institutions that also provide similar reports. And so the World Bank has reports, individual countries give reports, other multilateral organizations give reports on the economy. And so it's hard to say the IMF is key. Beyond that, the IMF also does technical assistance, or what they call capacity development, which includes not only technical assistance, but also training in their view. And so it's roughly about 30% of the budget is all spent on that, which is the second biggest amount of their money is spent. And so what this advice is think of it as they basically take a very smart economist, they pay for that economist to fly to that country and train a bunch of people in that country how to run their country better. Whether it's how to craft laws that have better policy effects, whether it is to craft laws that have better checks for transparency and to limit corruption so that when money does get given or decisions get made by that country, it can have better trust from the IMF and other industries and institutions to lend money to that country. And so the technical assistance is basically education or training. And so again, while this is something they give a bunch of money to, and it does have some pretty good effects, it is very hard to quantify that specific effect. That because the IMF set this one person trained this one person, which created this one law that saved this one life. That is going to be a very, very hard line to draw. And so while it is very hard to say this technical assistance is net bad because it's, free training, you can always say no. On the flip side, it is hard to quantify the effect, and you can say that there is no impact from each of the specific effects. Beyond that, the technical assistance has specific effects. And so a lot of the technical assistance might be them sending some people to train a country on how to better adapt their policies to fight climate change. The IMF has been very forward, saying climate change is real. It's going to affect the economy. And if the economy is going to be tanked in the future because of climate change, then your ability as a country to repay loans might be affected, or just your need to get loans might be affected. If your entire country goes underwater because of flooding, you're more likely going to have to take out loans in the future. And so the IMF is providing this technical assistance so countries can better adapt their country to adapt to climate change or mitigate the effects from it. Build more dams or build more seawalls or do this sort of program to minimize the damage from climate change, which means that they'd be less likely to need, when that damage comes, to go to other international institutions and say, I screwed up, now I need money, because you've actually fixed your institutions prior to getting the money. Beyond that, something the IMF has done too recently in a few years, is they've kind of made a very big push on bridging the gender gap. And so there's been a lot of studies they've published on how gender affects social stability and just the economy in general in a lot of developing countries, and that countries should be adapting and changing their policies to better promote gender inclusion. And if they can solve the gender gap, that will spill over and solve a whole host of other problems in that country. And so while the IMF isn't super into, I'm only going to give you this loan if you guarantee a woman's in power or something, it's not quite that explicit. So it's less on the loan conditions. The gender is very, very important still within just technical assistance abroad and how they're training countries to change their laws by trying to bridge the gender gap. So let's now talk about some more con arguments. So all about these loans being bad because there are these conditions attached on them, and the country is in a need, and they need this money, and they're going to die if they don't get this money, and so they take this loan, and they didn't read the fine print, and now 6 months later they read the fine print, and it's even worse than death. They've given away all their resources, all their lives, future slavery to the IMF, simply because in a time of need they signed without reading the fine print. That is what the negative story is going to be in a nutshell, and they're going to pick various different routes to say, here's when the IMF had this one condition that took advantage of a country and was bad. And let's go through a few of those, and I'm going to kind of explain them with a few funny little cartoons you can look at to get the joke. And so the first one is about inequality. There are arguments to be had that the IMF puts certain conditions because they want to get paid back immediately, and to get paid back, there can't be budget deficits. If the government is spending all this money on these programs and they're not collecting enough taxes, then they're having to borrow more money to offset that debt. And if they're borrowing money from the IMF, but that debt doesn't go down, the next year they're going to have to borrow more, and the next year they'll have to borrow more, and will always be borrowing more and more. And so one condition the IMF makes is a plan to reduce their debt, and so they could eventually have some hope of paying it all off. Now, traditionally, what this meant was the governments got to choose what to cut. And what these authoritarian governments likely chose is they got to choose, do I cut my own rich benefits to my elites? No. Do I cut all of this money that I send to my military that's keeping me in power? No. If I don't cut their money, I'm out of power. So instead, I start cutting money to healthcare or food subsidies or local projects for local farmers, all things that might be nice, but if I cut, it's not going to cost me my spot in power. And so I'm willing to take it out on the poor and cut programs for them to ensure I get this money from the IMF that then I can then spend and just build a new palace. And so primarily, that is the inequality argument in a nutshell, that countries will cut social services, they will get rid of safety nets, the poor will suffer just so the rich person can get some more money to stay in power a little bit longer than they likely would have. And so that is the negative story in a nutshell on inequality. Beyond that, it's, the pro answer to this is a little flipped, and we'll talk about this a little bit later on recency and some answers, but it's not necessarily universally that way, and the IMF has changed in the last decade to have various social safety net minimums and conditions that say countries can't do this. Their conditions have shifted more toward corruption-oriented conditions and less toward, cut whatever, just make sure you pay us back. There's also the history of colonialism, which is that the IMF has, all of this debt is not necessarily the country's fault. It could be large international corporations or whole histories of who they've put in power in that country because how the maps were drawn when colonial powers came in and took over and put this one ethnic group in who has been oppressing this other ethnic group for 50, 100 years plus. All of that stuff, that history goes into what's going wrong with these countries now. And so for the IMF to come back and say, to get more money, we're going to need some more conditions. If these IMF, which is largely run by these European powers, then if they're the ones getting to establish more conditions and they created the problem in the first place, they're pretty much profiting off of problems they created in the first place. And so a lot of people say it's unfair, it's racist, it's colonialist, simply because, the IMF has created these problems to cause the countries to fail, or larger institutions of colonialism that have caused these problems. And the solution is to go to the hand that has bitten you to ask for more food. And instead, it's going to just put you in a worse situation. And so that is an argument the negative could also say. Beyond that, export industry growth, which is just a traditional story, used to be that the IMF would say, we need you to pay us back. In order to pay us back, you got to create a product. You can't pay us in your own currency because your currency is worthless. The reason why you're coming to us in the first place is because you can't print any more money. If you could, as an authoritarian, you would just print more money and build your palace or do whatever. But because if you print more money now, you cause too much inflation and you make everyone go poor in your country, you're now asking for other institutions to give you more money. And before we give you this money, when in a different currency, of course, this is going to be in the US dollar, we want to make sure you can pay us back in US dollars because the currency that you're printing is worthless. And so to pay us back in US dollars, you're going to have to sell a product that other countries are going to pay you in US dollars. And so that product you're doing of just selling rice to your own citizens, that citizens not paying in US dollars, so that's useless. So you need to have more export-oriented industries. So industries that are going to create a product that you can then sell to other countries. Those other countries will pay you in a different currency that is worthwhile. And then with that currency that you collect from these export industries, we can ensure you pay us back with that. And so the traditional negative story is countries shift to these export industries. So we're going to cut a bunch of trees down, and then we're going to sell these trees to other countries, or we're going to drill a bunch of oil and not care that we ruin the environment because we want to sell this oil to other countries and get back a US dollar for that oil to ensure we can pay back the IMF and make the IMF happy. One problem with this is this export-oriented industry focus is something that the IMF pretty much stopped doing for a large part in 2000s. They have recognized that a sustainable growth is more important than short-term growth, and so export-oriented industries might not be as a popular IMF strategy as it used to be. Beyond that, too, there's a little bit element of environmental racism going on where the United States and big powers get to say, hey, we got to spend 200 years cutting down all of our trees and polluting our environment to have rapid industrialization to make us rich. But now that we've gotten rich and we know it's bad, we're telling all these other countries that didn't get to have that industrialization step that, sorry, you can't do it because it would be too bad for your environment, so stay poor. And so there's a little bit of environmental racism there, saying that the countries cannot choose to exploit their own natural resources, which other countries that were, white and European did do and got rich off of. They are not allowed to because we are telling them it would not be good for their own best interest without letting them make their own decision on what's good for their own interests. Beyond that, another con argument, of course, civil war, terrorism, etc., that the IMF is going in, it is hurting the country so much that it is causing more inequality, causing more ethnic groups to fight, and that is ultimately only causing an increased likelihood for civil war or hurting democracy or causing ethnic tensions or terrorism, whatever variable they want to take it to. And so that is an element that teams can go from an inequality route to start to get to an impact that's more lives lost, specific civil wars, things like that. And so that is an element to be aware of as well that the con will talk about. Environment, we've talked about this a little bit, that on the flip side, a lot of people say that these conditions shift to export-oriented industries and hurt the environment. And so I've given you a few examples of that already. Beyond that as well, the IMF has had some shift in some of their technical assistance and individual charitable contributions to actually try to fight climate change for minor little things that they have done to support it. And so that's something as well, that the IMF's technical assistance has changed. And with their technical assistance, they've started to realize, look, it's probably not in the country's best interest to chop down all their forests to pay us back. And so the new policies of the IMF aren't really causing some of those export-oriented strategies that hurt the environment, which they used to in the 80s and 90s. One big, super important part of this topic is what the alternative to the IMF is. So in a truth testing topic, it's debatable on whether this is even topical. So the topic just says, what do the harms of the IMF outweigh the benefits? And so it's individually, look at the IMF, have they done good or bad as is? Now, the question is how do you compare that as is? What is the alternative to the IMF? Is it just no loans? Or is it the same loan but with different conditions just given by a different country or institution? And so if it's no loan, then the pro can get up and say, we're giving money that wouldn't have been given regardless, thus we are helping people not starve. Or we're giving debt relief that wouldn't have been given regardless, thus we're helping people not starve. Alternatively, the neg can get up and be like, all of these loans had conditions on them that caused all these effects, and if they didn't have these loans at all, there would be no conditions and there would be no effects. That is one world of debating it. Another world of debating it, though, is thinking about, well, maybe the alternative to the IMF is not no loan, it's the same loan just with a different person. And so if the question isn't whether they get a loan or not, but just who is the one paying for the loan, is it the United States-led IMF because they have that 15% veto power? Or is it alternative institutions that if it's not the IMF, that could be run by other organizations? BRICS was a popular one. There are some other ones done in China that are more Chinese-oriented investment firms. There is Asian Development Bank and things like that that give hundreds of millions and billions of dollars of their money that do similar things to the IMF. And so maybe in the world without the IMF, those alternative institutions would be stronger and have more money. And maybe those alternative institutions would be net better or net worse than the IMF. I think this is a super strategic part and something that the majority of the topic, from a strategy perspective, you should focus on, because if you win this trick, it answers all of your opponent's generic IMF good, bad stuff. Because you can say, yes, the IMF condition was bad, but the condition would have been twice as bad if it was a BRICS-oriented condition. Or vice versa, you can say, yes, that condition, that loan was good, that money they gave out was good, but if it wasn't the IMF, it would be money still given out by an alternative institution, which would be net better because maybe it had better conditions. And so that is a super important part, because for all of the generic reasons why loans are good or bad, technical assistance is good or bad, or even surveillance is good or bad, if there are other institutions that can do it better or worse, that is a super strategic part of the topic that makes it very small, that if you win this, you can control the direction of any type of scenario anyone brings up against you. And so I think this is a core nexus question that, while from a truth perspective, I don't really believe in competitiveness as much as these authors might, I think from a strategy perspective, it is super, super important to be on top of this. Let's talk about 3 methodological issues that are important for this topic. One is, when is their data from? what examples of the IMF? So the topic just says IMF good or bad. And so historically, you can look at all of the years. It could be 200, it's been around for 50, 70 years, right? Something like that. And so for those 70 plus years that the IMF has been around, do you look at the bad stuff they did their first 20 and say those bad things they did their first 20 outweigh the good things they've done their last 20? Is that proper impact calculus? Maybe. What about future changes? The IMF's going to be around for hundreds, maybe thousands of years from now. How do you weigh those potential future gains or changes from the IMF versus past things the IMF might have done wrong? And maybe you say there were 10 years where the IMF did a lot of bad stuff, but then there were a bunch of years in the future where they're going to do good stuff because they've changed their rules to stop doing those bad stuff. And so while in a truth testing topic, it's not like a policy topic where it's saying the resolve, the IMF should be abolished, and you're looking purely at the future of effects of if the IMF was abolished today, what would be the effect tomorrow? This topic is a truth testing topic, and so it doesn't really specify. Some of the past is probably part of it. Some of the future is probably part of it. How you weigh between the two is ultimately up to you. Still, I think if a strong argument saying the status quo solves will benefit the pro a bunch. And so a lot of the reasons that say the IMF did bad things is what the IMF did a long time ago. And so the people who are in charge of the IMF now, maybe 15, 20 years ago, were writing papers criticizing what the IMF was doing then. And so different people become in charge. They learn from their mistakes because if they have a certain condition that crashes the economy of that country, then the country's not going to pay them back. And then they go back to the drawing board and say, okay, maybe that condition wasn't a good thing to add to the loan because it hurt our ability to actually make the loan work and to make the country sustainable. And so every few years, the IMF does a review where they have a bunch of people study all their processes, say, here's what worked, here's what doesn't, here are recommendations to change. And so I think the last one was actually 2018. It's not listed here, but just to show you some of the changes that have happened on the chart, as well as the new types of agreements. So they shifted from a quota system doing a majority of the funding to some of those alternative financial arrangements we've talked about, multilateral borrowing agreements, bilateral borrowing agreements, etc., have kind of shifted to in the last few years. And so this is important because you can say their evidence got fixed. It might have been a problem then, it ain't a problem now, or it might have been a good thing then, but the IMF stopped doing it, and they can't say they're going to do it in the future. And so I think this is an important issue to be on top of methodology-wise. Second, this is endless claims. One thing you kind of realize from this topic is there are a bunch of people that make absurd claims that the IMF does bad things. IMF personally killed millions of poor people throughout the world. And you read their evidence, and it might seem like there's some stormtrooper that showed up with guns. The guns had IMF labels on them, and they just shot all the poor people they could because that's what they were told to do by their IMF boss, who looks like the devil and has horns coming out of their ears. And there's someone that says that, but does that mean it's true? No. And that person might even be an expert. They're an economist. They've studied the issue a bunch, but that doesn't really mean anything. And so one important theme of our team, and hopefully you've learned in previous topics, is that one strong controlled study is worth thousands of expert predictions, because you can find an expert in a card to say anything, and it's until you've done a systematic review of all of the available data and have created a controlled study where you've correlated that data through regressions to sort of imply causation. That is the gold standard that you should be seeking when trying to make predictions of whether the IMF is good or bad, because everyone's going to say IMF was bad in this country. IMF was bad in this one instance. Does that mean that all countries were like that? No. If they were bad in one country but good in 148, who wins? And so the size of the sample super important, the dates of the sample super important, and what they do for a control is super important. And so all things to think about is what is the proof someone has for what they're saying, because anyone can have a warrant that makes logical sense, but being very good about going through and sifting through these competing warrants and saying, you got a warrant to why it's true, I got a warrant to why it's not true. We use data to prove which one of us is right and who has the best data. That is the way to kind of approach this topic. Let's talk a little bit about indigeneity. So I think it cut off a little bit of my chart when I converted it, but here are some common things to think about for this selection bias. And a lot of people are going to talk about self-selection bias. And so it's a very complicated concept in regressions, and there's a lot of solutions to them, but I'm going to pick the very simplest one and the one that you should kind of focus on in most of the rounds. And so if you look at this little chart to the bottom left, you'll see the basic selection bias goes as follows. If I have a country that got IMF loans and they've been given a loan and then the next year their GDP drops 10%, is that proof that it's the IMF loan that caused their GDP to drop 20% or 10%? Now, in PF logic, you're going to have a ton of cards that say that. You know, here's my snapshot 1 year, then IMF loan, and the next year it went up or down this number of lives. Ergo, IMF saved lives or killed people. Proof. And that's going to be considered, you know, great PF proof in a lot of your rounds. The problem with that is just because the IMF gave the loan isn't the only thing that determined whether that country's economy worked or not. So for example, if the country's economy was going down by 20% the year before they got the loan, because it was had all of these problems with how they did their policy, their taxes were all screwed up, they were super corrupt, and it was causing a 20% drop in GDP. Then the IMF gave a loan, had conditions, fixed the country's policies, and the next year GDP only dropped 10%. Now we're looking at like the IMF did good. And so that, you know, baseline comparison of seeing, are there other variables that caused the underlying problem they're trying to assert the IMF was responsible for? Is there an omitted variable that not only affected the end result, but also affected that IMF variable? And so if there's, you know, for example, the countries that get IMF loans are poor countries. And does that mean the IMF loan is making them poor? Maybe not. Maybe it's the fact that they were poor, they had to get a loan in the first place, and maybe the IMF loan makes them more or less poor depending upon how you look at the data. And so self-selection is important because when you select just IMF countries, if the only IMF countries that are getting the loans are the poor ones, have you proved that IMF loans cause poverty? No, because you've self-selected biased data of just those IMF countries that are poor, and then made an assumption that thus it must be the IMF that's causing their poverty, when in reality, the data set you selected of just those IMF countries, there was something already making them poor, whether it's institutional corruption or something like that, unsustainable policies, things like that. And it's those underlying things that are causing them to be poor, not the IMF. This is super important. A lot of studies, basically any study that does this, has a large paragraph about the selection bias issue and how they decided to address it. And so there are different statistical solutions to approach it, instrumental variables, GMM, there's like a Heckman selection model, things like that. And so there are different solutions to this. Knowing them all is maybe not as super important, but at least knowing that your author had a solution to it is. And it's something you should be on top of. And so